they've been talking about this kind of stuff for 5 or 6 years now, these same sort of skill sets, capabilities. Why aren't we there yet? Is there a failure at some level, and what can we do to actually get going on it?
Do you want to kick us off?
Well, I don't know, can you hear me? So I guess for me one of those issues is, so if you look at the set of skills that I talked about, well, that you get in terms of the stuff about the craft of governance, and then we talked about around collaboration, communication, judgment, stewardship, all the other ones that I talked about. None of those are very easy, are they? They're all really, really difficult. And so, I mean, I do a lot of work around collaboration, and time and again it kind of amazes me that people kind of say, well, we've been doing this for 18 months now, and it hasn't kind of set the world alight. And it hasn't, because it's just really, really difficult stuff. What hasn't necessarily helped, always helped is that often we use still relatively kind of public admin type mechanisms to try to get to some of these sorts of stuff. So they tend to, involve processes or structures or things like that. And actually, it's a more challenging kind of relational set of skills. A lot of them boil down to that take time to develop. So, I mean, I don't think we should beat ourselves up about the fact that we've been talking about this for a while and we haven't delivered it, actually, because it's, a lot of this is really, really difficult. And it does exist in practice, in pockets and in areas across a number of different places. It'll take time to develop it, though. And as I say, I mean, it's the more we can invest in the developmental type approaches and support people in critical and reflective practice, the better able we'll be able to develop some of those things with my take on it.
I mean, the point I'd add is you can't just look at the capability. You've got to think about the wider settings within which capability is exercised. And for me, there's still more enabling we need to do about essentially unlocking some of those capabilities. I mean, I think it's very interesting. When I look at what happened in New Zealand after the Canterbury earthquakes, boy, you got a lot of innovation, people responding, really quickly, collaborating, and that worked because we, throughout the old rule book, and people had to improvise. I think we've also seen that with some of the social sector trials that Mr. English talked about, the importance around some of those place-based initiatives. When you do get leaders who've got those qualities, the results they really are able to generate. So I think it's there's an issue about how do we grow those capabilities, the ANDers, and we've got to have operating models within organisation and across the system that essentially incentivise those behaviours and allow them to flourish.
One thing I should have said before I resumed this session was that we're planning to finish at 4:30. So my response to that is fairly short. If you look at the theory about organisation culture generically, or particularly in the private sector, I say for any substantial organisation it takes 6 to 12 years to change the culture, which many companies often handle by changing the bodies instead of the culture. So I endorse the comment that this is difficult. Okay, down the back there. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Mike Woods from Productivity Commission. Ian, you used a wonderful phrase, the monastic nature of the policy profession, and it sort of struck a chord, but the immediate image that came to mind was of the monk who thinks deeply about the meaning of life, but who's living a solitary life in a cell, drinking water and eating dry crusts. But when I look at our organisation, I see a bunch of monks who have thrown open the doors of the monastery, who engage with the people, who have a dialogue with them on what the meaning of life is all about, who do the analysis, harvest the evidence, and then offer guidance on what the nature of well-being is all about. I was just wondering what image you particularly wanted to draw in the phrase that you used about the monastic nature of the policy profession.
I think that sort of monastic nature is more that the community is still relatively closed, and I don't say that in an absolute sense. And I think that some of the challenges are that certainly in New Zealand, some of our policy agencies are separated from delivery functions. As in many other places, delivery is happening beyond the public sector. So some of the connections between the policy analyst and, if you like, the intervention on the ground, they're long and thin lines. And I think all the point I was making is that actually, particularly if we're trying to think a bit about feedback loops that are a lot quicker, whether they're around regulatory issues or service delivery issues, we've got to have a way in which the policy community is much more engaged, if not embedded, in some of those wider relationships.
Okay, down the back there again, yeah.
Hi, we were just having a conversation, I work in the Department of Health and in the regulatory policy sort of setting and work quite closely with regulators. And we're having a discussion about, there's been a lot of talk about the generalist skills of a public servant, but there's also quite specialist skills needed by regulators, for example. So how do you get the balance right between those two?
This balance between generalists and specialists is something that we spent quite a while discussing in terms of our research. So one of the interesting things about the comparative international work is that if you look at the piece of research that my colleagues did in an English setting, there they say one of their issues is they don't have people with generalist skills. They've got a bunch of technical skills. Whether they're the right ones or the wrong ones is another issue. In our research in Australia, it's interesting is that a lot of people told us that there's too many generalists, that actually there's not enough in the way of technical expertise. And I think there's a few different things that are going on here at the same time. And I won't go into all the detail around that. But I think one of the issues here is because the legacy of the industrial kind of model, as we were saying, has built up so much that there isn't always the kind of detailed strategic planning about the kind of skills and capabilities and capacities that there might be. So actually, at an outset, there isn't necessarily a sense of, well, what are the set of skills that we need? What are the competencies that we need to be able to deliver this sort of role? And that's not just a kind of an out-and-out critique of public servants and public service organisations. That's a really, really difficult question. A couple of years ago, I spent a couple of years doing a piece of research with the Department of Health in England to work out what the core competencies of healthcare commissioners would be. If you don't have a service delivery role, what do commissioners absolutely need to have specialist expertise around in order to be able to design and shape services effectively? So that's something that needs some significant and time and attention in thinking about. And having had a sense of what those skills and what the balance of those needs to be, then there's an additional conversation about whether they're ones that we need to develop, and it's absolutely crucial that we hold within public service organisations, or whether that's something that you can buy in and you can contract for. And I mean, that's been talked about around a number of things, including kind of regulation skills, but also about in the design principles and kind of IT skills and things like that.
I might add something to that because I think that's a very serious question, made even more serious by another factor that affects all these interactions between agencies and other entities, and that is that there's often turnover in those who are doing the representing, and the turnover is for good reason, because there's mobility and promotion and all that sort of stuff. But it means that quite often, in fact, I remember being a fly on the wall for a research project where the Department of Human Services in Victoria decided to establish a particular relationship on a trial basis with a large non-profit organisation. And over the 9-month period I observed it, twice the lead person for the department changed. Interestingly, that didn't happen on the other side, but you'd see this sort of exasperation. They had to sort of go right through building the relationship again. And in thinking about solutions to that, going to your question, that it may well be a very useful thing to do to, in fact, have a team that represents, or even a duo, and not sort of, you know, in a sense, in best sense of portfolio management, not have the one person who can do it disappear from the exercise. Let's try this side here, and then we'll go to there.
Hello, Tamara Cutcliffe from the Institute of Public Administration. The Victorian ANZSOG and IPA Community of Practice in Regulation has been doing some work on a draft regulation professional standard. Right. That's going to be the third in a series. We already have a professional standard in the public sector for policy and also for procurement. So this is a third regulation. A draft will be available via the Victorian IPA office in the next month, and we're doing that in conjunction with ANZSOG, IPA, and also the ANAO. Janine O'Flynn's been involved in the development of the policy professional standard, and yeah, we welcome feedback on those professional standards. I know there's been a bit of interest from the New Zealand government in the regulatory one. We've also had input from the Canadian government on the regulatory one.
Thank you for that. That's terrific. I've always wanted to say this. We'll take that as a compliment. A comment, I mean. Someone down here. Yeah.
David Wansborough from the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries. You invited us to be provocative, so I will take up that challenge with glee. Have we really got the problem diagnosis right on this one? Like, surely we haven't just invented collaboration, entrepreneurialism, risk management, and you know, they just used to be called wisdom, experience, teamwork, and you know, just getting things done sensibly. Isn't the problem more that we've been lazy and that we've allowed rules, bureaucracy and process to replace those?
Thank you for being provocative there. I mean, there's a few issues that come up for me there. I say the problem diagnosis is established. I've spent sort of a year now being the stupid foreigner who can walk around and ask people really stupid questions as I kind of get to grips with the university and the country and what have you. And what you tend to find is people, they can tell you generally where we need to, what direction we need to go in and what some of the challenges, but as I say, there are fewer fewer senses of how we get to that point. So I think, and this relates to what Andrew Tugg was saying before about actually we are quite good at some aspects of the diagnosis. We might disagree on some of the detail, but actually we know what we've got to do. We know what some of those challenges are. Whether we're being lazy, I wouldn't ever use that term myself. I don't know many public servants personally who are lazy and who live up to that sort of stereotype. And this idea about, I mean, I find it problematic when people say, do we rely on, you know, process and bureaucracies and things like that. Actually, bureaucracies and the kind of accountability structures that they give us particular things that we value as communities. So I think you would not go out into the general population and get a great number of people who would agree that they want you to go off and take their their tax money or take whatever other revenue that the government has and go and spend it with kind of wild abandon in a way that's not thought through in detail at all. And so some of these processes and these accountability structures, they don't come about because public servants are inherently wedded to them and they love them and they're the things that fulfill them in terms of their life. They're the things that we as a community want our governments to have. And so so that's why I don't think it's an issue of laziness. I think it's an issue of huge complexity that we as a community, we can simultaneously demand of government that we want transparency, we want accountability, we want to know who's responsible when something goes wrong. If a child dies who's under child protection, we want to know who we can sack. But at the same time, we want agility, we want efficiencies, we want productivity, we want all those sorts of things. So it's an impossible kind of situation to deliver that in. And I think to say it's an issue of laziness is not helpful.
Did you want to say anything, Ian? I think we've got time for one more question. Down there.
Tom Groscott from the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. We're very much a destination agency. People love to work for the environment, and that's where they come. We have very high levels of retention rates. A lot of the trends and the things that I hear being talked about really are saying to us that's not the way of the future. So I guess I've got 2 points, two parts to my question. Firstly, how do you think that might play out for destination agencies such as ours? And what about the structural, and I'm here predominantly thinking about the remuneration structures that we have in place that sit alongside this kind of mobility that we're looking for, particularly in and out of the public service. For me personally, probably cost me close to $500,000 worth of superannuation if I was to leave now voluntarily.
Well, I think there's a few responses to that. One is, I think, at the end of the day, individuals are going to make career choices about their pathways, and absolutely, in the public sector, there are going to be many ladders to heaven, and actually, I think it's in our interest that we have people who align very strongly with the mission and purpose of an organisation, and they may not align with the mission and purpose of other public sector agencies, and I think that's fine. This is not a model about everyone kind of moving around in a sort of a big churn. The reality is, though, I think what for people who do see themselves as being leaders through the system, I think reality is we have to put on the table that those people need to have probably a different profile of experiences than the generation that came before them. And then it's up to them about actually what, whether that's the world they want to live in. Your second point about, remuneration, etc., I think, if you take the 10-year view, I think we'll need to progressively work on a number of issues that actually get in the way of that mobility. And I think, in a system sense, we'll need to sort of connect up systems that, for 25 years we've kind of broken down. But I don't think that is the big barrier between the kinds of shifts we want to make. A lot of it's a bit about how we talk to people about how they can make a difference. And I think, we can see some quite big shifts even in the presence of those barriers in the short to medium term.
I'll just quickly say two things. What if you're a kind of a destination department then, and you don't have those challenges around kind of recruitment and retention, and you've got kind of high performance staff coming in, then actually I think you've got a responsibility around modelling some of these sorts of behaviours and trying some of them out. And I think the only way that these will move is through kind of lower level piloting, then moving into more kind of systematic approaches around some of this sort of stuff. So I think your department would be one of the ones that you would hope would be able to make a significant contribution in terms of this space. I take your point about the mobility issue, and it is interesting. So I've talked to about 50 people about this issue, and broadly about half think mobility is impossible, particularly if you're talking about not just between government departments, but also out into broader public service institutions. And the other half think we're just making a big fuss over a little issue. So there's a point of disagreement there, and I think there is genuinely some more work needs to be done around what this would look like if we were to be able to effectively support mobility. But one of the issues for me is in terms of public services, we've got a huge resource that of a range of different types of roles in a range of different kind of policy areas and geographical areas. And we could tell a much more positive story about public services than we currently do if we actually thought about using these collectively in a more systematic sort of way. So I think that's working through some of those issues is one part of that kind of broader conversation around that area.
Well, on that very positive note, I think this is a good time to round off because we've reached the allotted time. I'm very grateful to Helen and Ian for not only giving what they had prepared, but for adapting and making that fit into the circumstances. It's a good example of agility, I think, in the area of government. So before I call on Gary Banks to conclude the program, I invite you to thank our speakers and using